If you're going to ask a question in English, you can do it with various means, various syntactic means. You can say, "Are you going?" You can say, "You're going?" Or you can even do it non-verbally. In the right context, you can just raise your eyebrows, make a gesture, and that constitutes a question. But there is a certain syntax which is conventionally associated with questions. That is to say, there's a clause type which seems to be associated with that speech act, and the clause type is the interrogative clause type. Interrogatives can be cross-classified in various ways in English. If we look only at root clauses, we can distinguish between two main types of interrogatives. That is WH interrogatives and polar interrogatives. Polar interrogatives, or yes-no questions, are questions which can, at least in principle, be answered yes or no. So examples of a polar interrogative are things like, "Are you going?" "Is he coming?" WH interrogatives, on the other hand, are examples like, "Who is coming?" "What did she see?" "Where did he go?" "How did you do that?" In this case, the nature of the answer expected is indicated by a phrase that occurs at the beginning of the question, which usually includes a WH word, like what or where. How counts as a WH word even though it doesn't have the phonology or the spelling. WH interrogatives are introduced either by a special word like what or where or who or when or how, or by a phrase that includes that word. That is to say, a phrase that includes a WH word, like which books, or what place, or how many books. Interrogatives can also occur in embedded context, in the complement to different kinds of heads, most commonly perhaps as the complements of verbs, but they can also occur as the complements of adjectives, of prepositions, and of nouns. This is true both for polar interrogatives, in which case they'll be introduced either by whether or if. It's also possible to have embedded WH interrogatives, which can be introduced by the same WH phrases that you find in root questions. There are various questions about the syntax of these interrogatives. Where is the WH phrase in these questions? Where is the auxiliary in these questions exactly? What is the source of the difference between root interrogatives and embedded interrogatives? And we're going to look at some of those questions about questions. In English, both root and embedded WH interrogatives begin with a WH phrase. And that, in fact, is contrary to the typical order of the sentence in English, which is a classic SVO language. In root clauses, there's also something going on with the auxiliary. So, in fact, the simplest case, the one we'll start with, is looking at embedded interrogatives. If you look at the contrast between an embedded declarative, like, "I think that they will eat lentils for dinner," and an embedded interrogative, like, "I wonder what they will eat for dinner," we notice two things about the interrogative. One is that the embedded clause is introduced by this WH word, what, and the other is that the verb in that clause doesn't have a noun phrase following it. That's surprising because eat normally is followed by a complement. It's a transitive verb. What we see then is that the selectional requirement of eat, that it be followed, that it take a complement, and it's the thematic role that it normally assigns to its complement, these seem to be satisfied instead by this WH phrase, which nevertheless is not in the correct position. It's not where you'd expect it to be, given what we know about selection and given what we know about thematic role assignment. So in that sense, the WH phrase seems to be displaced with respect to what we know about these two phenomena, selection and theta role assignment. We find exactly the same kind of phenomenon if we look instead at agreement. So we know that normally a verb agrees with something which is very local to it, a finite verb agrees with the subject, normally immediately to its left. For example, we can say, I believe that he has said that 20 women have left. So we get has agreeing with he and have agreeing with 20 women. But notice in the interrogative, you could say something like, I wonder how many women he has said have left. And that's the only possible agreement to get there. So again, we find that we have plural agreement on have, but in this case, it doesn't seem to be local. The element that it's agreeing with, the plural women, isn't immediately to its left. It's much further away. So again, a WH phrase is behaving as though it were in a different position to the position where we actually find it. It behaves as though it's further down in the structure. We might wonder whether all we need to do to account for this phenomenon in interrogatives is just to come up with an additional structure for sentences which says that, well, sometimes the object can appear after the verb and sometimes the object can appear at the beginning of the sentence. We might think that we could deal with this strange position of the object just by coming up with an alternative structure for sentences. So we could say that English is sometimes SVO and sometimes OSV. But that isn't going to actually account for what we find. In particular, what we notice is that the questioned object doesn't necessarily appear at the beginning of its own clause, as it were. It can appear arbitrarily far away from the verb which licenses it, the verb which assigns it a thematic role, or the verb with which it agrees. So, for example, we'll get not only, I wonder who he admires, but I wonder who they say he admires, or I wonder who she thinks they say he admires. So the distance between the who and admires, the verb which assigns it a thematic role and which requires it as a complement, can be arbitrarily large. And we find exactly the same phenomenon with agreement. So we find alongside, I wonder how many workers are on strike, cases like, I wonder how many workers he thinks are on strike, or I wonder how many workers they say he thinks are on strike.
This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.